Well, welcome again to the International Conference on Creative Territories for Sustainable Development. I am Jorge Piquet, founder of Urbis Nova and manager of the Porto Alegre Creative District here in Brazil. To discuss creative districts and creative tourism, I present Greg Richards. Richards is professor of placemaking and events at the University of Applied Sciences, Breda, and professor of leisure studies at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. He has worked extensively in the field of cultural tourism, and he is the creator of the new concept of creative tourism. His current research interests focus on the creative use of space for the creation of places and cultural, social, and economic development. Hello, Greg. How are you? And welcome to our conference.
Hi, George. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here, although I'd rather be in Brazil.
Okay, so I have some questions to you. My first question is, you have been researching tourism and leisure for many, many years. But in 2014, you published a set of case studies called Creative Districts Around the World, which is available on the web. First, what made you interested in creative districts and what is your general view today?
Well, at the time that we produced the book called Creative Districts Around the World, which I wrote together with Lenny and Marks, um, I was working with her on a course in creative industries at Breda University of Applied Sciences, where I'm still working. And we discovered that there weren't many books that we could use for that course. And so we started to create our own, inviting people to contribute case studies looking at creative districts in different parts of the world. So we managed to collect a very interesting set of case studies, and we use that for our teaching and also for our research. I mean, that wasn't the first moment at which we became interested in the theme of creative districts. At the University of Tilburg, I worked with Hans Momas, who is one of the first people who did specific research on creative districts. He wrote a paper in Urban Studies, which has been widely quoted on creative districts and issues of policy. So it goes back a good 20 years or more in terms of our research activity in that area. I think in the beginning we didn't see the kind of scale that creative districts would reach. It was an interesting phenomenon which was just emerging around the turn of the millennium, and we were examining the different kind of contexts in which creative districts were emerging, what kind of policies were related to the growth of creative districts, and what kind of experiences were being provided in creative districts. And of course, at that time, the creative industries was also being identified as a major area of growth in tourism and leisure, and also in the economy in general. So it was an area that more and more policymakers were interested in. We were writing at the time about creative districts in the Netherlands. Richard Florida was invited to Amsterdam in 2003 to talk to them about how to develop the creative industries and in particular creative districts. So there was a lot happening around the theme of creative districts at that time. And since then, attention for the theme has only got greater. I think what has happened in the intervening 20 years or so is that the districts that we were looking at then were fairly small. They were fairly marginal in terms of the cultural sector, certainly, and also they were poorly linked to leisure and tourism. What has happened since is that creative districts have become much more central in cultural and creative policies. They've become much more linked to tourism policy and to leisure development. And if you look globally, then creative districts have also become much more large scale, many more visitors, many more creative enterprises, and in general, much bigger areas and much bigger economic impacts as well. So really, creative districts in the last 20 years have moved from the margins of academic inquiry and economic activity into a much more central position.
Okay, very interesting. And have you noticed during these last decades a shift in creative districts from an elite culture to other more popular cultural manifestations? It seems that this is one of the themes of your most recent book from 2021, Rethinking Cultural Tourism.
Yeah, clearly the book on cultural tourism is not about creative districts specifically, but it has a strong link with the development of creative districts. The kind of theoretical basis of that work leans heavily on the work of Luigi Sacco about the development of the cultural economy in general. And so we see an evolution from what he calls culture 1.0, which is basically the consumption of high culture as a form of education. So people going to the leading museums and monuments to consume things related to the elements of elite culture that we're very familiar with, painting and sculpture and so on. That was, of course, the origin of cultural tourism. It was the backbone of the Grand Tour in Europe in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And that is a form of cultural tourism which has been replicated in many different places. So crowds of people going to leading museums is nothing new, really. But what happened in the late 1980s and the early 1990s was that cities and regions and national governments as well discovered culture and creativity as potential engines for economic growth. And so in what Pierluigi Sacco calls Culture 2.0, cities began to use museums as ways of stimulating economic growth, stimulating expenditure, and of course, attracting tourists to generate expenditure from outside the city or region. So this became a very familiar system, which over the last 20 years has grown enormously to the stage where before the pandemic, we were talking about problems of over-tourism in many major cities, certainly in Europe, but also elsewhere. So the idea of kind of mass consumption of the pinnacles of elite culture became a kind of hallmark of this Culture 2.0 system. But in more recent years, Pierluigi Sacco talks about a Culture 3.0 development, which is based on the democratization of cultural production. So now we can all become cultural producers. We can put things on YouTube. We can make TikTok videos. We can also all become creative producers. And this has changed our relationship to culture, and it has also changed the way in which cultural tourism has been consumed. So in Culture 3.0, we have a wider range of actors entering the system. We have the growth of Airbnb and other sharing economy systems, and this has enabled peer-to-peer interaction, which means that you no longer need the tourism industry to provide your cultural tourism experiences. You can get those directly from locals. And so in the area of cultural tourism, the idea of consuming culture like a local or living like a local became very popular. And that was facilitated, of course, by the growth of Airbnb, and certainly in Europe by the growth of budget airlines. More recently, the integration of new technologies has enabled even more cultural development into a system of what we might call culture 4.0, where we are constantly surrounded by technology which we can use to make and consume and intermediate experiences, and those experiences are increasingly digital and online. And of course, we've seen in the pandemic the way in which our lives have shifted online. In this case, by default of the pandemic and legislation, but this has simply hastened a process which was already beginning, where museums were beginning to digitalize their collections, and now we are able to undertake digital tours using new technologies, augmented reality, virtual reality, and so on. And so we're moving into a situation where it's not just the production of culture, but the production of virtual culture, which is becoming important. So we're seeing a major change in culture in general, and that has had a big influence on cultural tourism. And that change has also facilitated creative tourism. So now you can very easily make contact with creative producers to arrange an experience of creative production, making some craft objects, learning how to cook local food, weaving textiles, all sorts of things. And that has become very much easier with new technologies and the possibilities afforded by Culture 4.0. So I think we see a general change in culture, which is also reflected in the way in which the creative industries are relating to places and also relating to tourism.
Okay, and let's talk about a little bit about big centers like Paris, Rome, or Barcelona. How do you see the relationship between traditional tourism models, where I include cultural tourism, and these big cultural cities like Paris or Barcelona?
Well, what we see in the large cultural cities is that a number of drivers are changing the way in which tourism articulates with the city and with culture in the city. So we used to have a situation where people visited major cultural sites, which were usually located in the center of cities. So hotels were also located in those areas, and much of what we would recognize as cultural tourism went on in city centers, basically. In the last couple of decades, that has changed, because now we're able to stay in people's homes in almost any area of the city. And much more significantly, we've also expanded our view of legitimate cultural objects to see and experience. So nowadays we're talking not just about consuming elite culture, but also consuming everyday culture, the extraordinary everyday, as we called it in a recent report. And what's happening is that people are in some ways disillusioned with the kind of experiences that they have in overcrowded museum galleries. They have, in many cases, already seen many of the highlights of the places they're visiting. And so they want to do something different and something a bit more distinctive. And that distinction comes not from passive consumption of museums or taking photos of famous sites, but increasingly in relating to places and to people in those places on a much more personal level. And so we see the rise of what we call relational tourism, where people seek to increase their own knowledge and skills by relating to other people. And this is one of the very important drivers of creative tourism as well, that people want to increase their own creative skills, and they want to exchange creative knowledge with people in the places that they visit. So in contrast to more traditional systems of tourism, you might argue that this is a more democratic, a more equal form of tourism, because it involves an exchange of skills and knowledge between people living in a particular area and people who are visiting the area. So it's no longer the traditional tourism system of the host serving the guest, but it is a system of co-creation where we exchange knowledge and skills with each other.
And Greg, you are the author of a new concept, creative tourism. Was this concept inspired by the ideas of creative city or creative industry, which were beginning to circulate at the time? And what is your current definition of creative tourism?
Well, I think there wasn't actually any relationship between the development of the creative tourism concept and ideas about creative industries or creative cities that were circulating at the time. The creative tourism concept came primarily from a project that we were running in the late 1990s called Eurotex, which was about the development of textile craft tourism in the periphery of Europe. And the idea was to develop tourism which would sustain traditional crafts which were in danger of dying out, and to provide an economic outlet for crafts producers so that they would carry on producing, and so that younger people would also see a future in entering the craft sector. So this was really a way of trying to sustain crafts in fragile peripheral regions. And what happened as we were developing that project was that we observed what happened in the interaction between tourists and creative producers. And what we found was that when people had the opportunity to engage in the creative process themselves and to interact directly with the creative producers rather than just buying something, this increased their level of interest, their engagement, and also their satisfaction. So we began to develop workshops which were aimed at generating creative experiences which would engage people with local creativity and local culture. So that was really the origin of the creative tourism concept. And it was only later that we began to make extensive links with the creative industries and the creative cities concepts, because we realized that in fact you could develop creative tourism in a lot of different situations, and that this might also include major cities, for example, and that developing creative tourism also was a way of supporting the creative industries. So I don't think that, theoretically, the origins of creative tourism had much to do with the discussions about creative industries or creative cities in the beginning, but it's certainly an area which now has many links.
And what is your current definition of creative tourism?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the definition has changed a lot over time, because we've seen over the last 20 years that creative tourism itself has changed.
Yes, I said current definition.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but the definition has been changing a lot, and so you will find a lot of different definitions around. And so you will find definitions not just from us, but also from other people, also from the European, the Creative Tourism Network, from the Criador project based in Portugal, for example. All of these different initiatives have been developing their own definitions of creative tourism. So even at the moment, you have different definitions depending on who you talk to. I mean, personally, I think that creative tourism is more about an idea, a concept, rather than a very close definition, because the concept itself has become so broad and so flexible that it's very difficult to encapsulate it in a single sentence. But I think that the core of creative tourism is about participative, creative experiences which generate some kind of feeling of being close to local creativity. And that's really what drives the creative tourism system. And if you look at creative tourism relative to cultural tourism, then of course there's much more emphasis on intangible culture as opposed to the tangible culture, which is the center of cultural tourism. And it's much more about active involvement rather than static consumption of objects or museums or monuments.
And how could creative tourism relate in general to creative districts, especially in small cities, which are outside the traditional touristic circuit? I believe this was also one of the themes of your book, Reinventing the Local in Tourism.
Yeah, it's been a theme that we've been working on for some time, and this relates to a growing interest in the issue of placemaking. So we have also changed our focus from, if you like, originally it was a tourism focus, because that's how we arrived at the creative tourism and therefore the creative districts uh, scene. But over the years, it's become increasingly obvious that you can't deal with tourism, or indeed the creative industries or creative districts, as isolated phenomena. These are things which are intimately interrelated, and therefore you need a holistic approach to researching and making policy for these places. And so what we've seen is that with this interest, as I mentioned, in increasingly in local places and everyday life, so smaller and smaller places have become enmeshed in this system of creative production and consumption. More and more cities have begun to develop creative districts. And we encapsulated a lot of these kind of developments in a more recent book on small cities with big dreams, which focuses on one particular Dutch city which used creativity to develop a new image for itself, a new mode of cultural tourism development, and also to boost the creative sector. And that was based on the development of creative activities, art exhibitions, but also the development of creative districts around not just museums, but also creative workshops and social innovation programs. And what was interesting about writing that book was the realization that small cities, smaller places could also be at the leading edge of the development of creative districts. It wasn't something that was restricted to the major cities at all, because smaller cities have also had similar challenges to large cities. It's just that very often they don't have the same kind of resources to deal with those challenges. So in a sense, smaller places have to get even more creative in their use of creative resources in order to kickstart economic growth. And we've seen in many different small cities in different countries very interesting examples of how creative districts can be kickstarted in these places as well.
Perfect. So, in your opinion, can creative tourism in creative districts play a role in sustainable development? For example, in South America and Africa, what do you know about this in this continent?
Well, I think creative tourism does offer an alternative. It has a very different approach and starting point from mass cultural tourism, for example. If we look specifically at examples in places like Asia and Africa and Latin America, then what we have seen is a lot of programs which have been based on crafts industries. So similar to the situation in Europe, there are many places where there are active crafts production systems which are in need of connection to global economic systems, and that has been something which has been developed in many places. In Thailand, for example, there is an extensive program of creative villages where creative tourism has been developed on the basis of a wide range of local crafts which are related to the local landscape and cultural resources. And that has been run by a national agency which has been working on that for over a decade. That has been very successful. But there have also been initiatives in Africa, very often on a much smaller scale, very often with the intervention of NGOs based in Europe or North America, because of the lack of local resources. So in many cases, it's a simple transition of existing cultural tourism programs where the typical kind of offering of a tour operator was going to a village for an hour or so, seeing the locals dance, and then buying a few souvenirs and going away. And with the development of creative tourism, the idea is that people have a more active involvement, which means they have to spend longer. If you want to seriously learn a skill, you probably have to stay for a few days, which means an overnight stay, which means eating there, which means much more money going directly into the pockets of the locals. So this is by definition a much more sustainable way of developing experiences for tourists. And it's also something which has been developing in interesting ways in Latin America. We've seen the development of programs in Bogota with five Bogota, which is based on the 5 senses, and that has been very successful in providing tourists and particular backpackers who have more time and interest in local culture, giving them an entry point into local culture in Bogota. But it's also something which is developed in Buenos Aires, for example, with the development of tango tourism, and also in Brazil. There is now a Brazilian network of creative tourism, Recria, which has a number of members, including Recife, which was the first city to really actively develop a network of creative tourism experiences. Of course, we had the initial experience of Porto Alegre in trying to develop creative tourism. That wasn't very successful because it didn't seem to have the kind of grassroots support that was necessary to make it sustainable. And I think that's mainly because it was a top-down political initiative, and it didn't manage to become embedded in the local community. In Recife, there's been a different approach where local communities have been involved right from the beginning, and so you can go and have a gastronomic experience in a favela. You can go and find out about carnival in different districts of the city, and so on. And that has been more successful and seems to be much more sustainable than the original Porto Alegre initiative. And those kind of programs are now spreading to other Brazilian cities as well. So I think it will be very interesting in future to see how creative tourism develops in Brazil and in other countries in Latin America. And hopefully it will prove to be a more sustainable, more bottom-up means of developing creative tourism.
Perfect. This is very important for our conference. And cultural tourism, despite being important in educating people, also has its problems, we know. What are, in your opinion, the difficulties of creative tourism? For example, the authenticity of experiences.
I think one of the interesting main difficulties of creative tourism, and there are a number. I won't pretend it's easy, but one of the main difficulties is actually convincing people that they have something creative and interesting to offer to tourists. Because if you think about the everyday creativity that is embedded in local communities, they don't see it. It's like a fish in water. So they do these things every day, and to the locals, they may be totally uninteresting. But when you present these things to tourists, suddenly they realize that they have creative skills and knowledge, which is interesting and engaging for others. And that has an interesting effect of increasing people's pride in their own creativity, and also making them realize that the creativity they have has a value beyond that of their everyday existence, and it has the potential to create economic benefits, but also social and cultural benefits as well. So tourism in particular becomes useful in that context because you have outsiders showing an interest in local creativity. And many people are interested to see what we call the extraordinary everyday of local places, and how that can provide a source of creativity for people. So I think that's one of the main difficulties. Another difficulty that is clearly present is the fact that creative tourism tends to be relatively small scale. So it's not something that interests the traditional tour operators by and large. So in countries where the tourism system is controlled by large companies, it can become challenging to develop creative tourism, which is based on one-to-one contacts between tourists and locals, which can be difficult to scale up to large numbers of people. And that means that tour operators in general want to do the more traditional styles of mass cultural tourism, which for them is more profitable. But of course, creative tourism, even when it's small scale, can be much more beneficial to local communities.
Okay, perfect. And my final question for you is, what is your advice for managers of creative districts in all countries, like me, who want to try out forms of creative tourism. What's your advice, Greg?
Well, I think my advice would be to start from a broader placemaking perspective. So, not thinking about a creative district just as somewhere where creativity happens, but to think about a creative district as part of a whole creative system for a place. So then you have to think about making contacts with other actors involved in the creative system, but also the cultural system, the tourism system, the social system, and so on. And if you want to get involved in these kind of placemaking processes, then the most important first step is to develop a vision for the city, the region, but also if you're managing a creative district, to develop a clear vision for the creative district itself. What is the role of the creative district? What is it doing for the city? What is the city doing for the creative district? Why is it there? These are very important questions that should be asked by the manager of every creative district, and I'm sure many do, but sometimes it's difficult to see a clear vision, particularly when creative districts have been developed as a kind of cookie cutter copy of creative districts elsewhere. I mean, the strongest visions tend to emerge from districts which have been developed in a much more bottom up local way, because then they tend to reflect the character and the cultural DNA of the place that they're in, and then it becomes much easier to develop a vision of what should be done. Then I think if you have a sound vision, you need to think about the creative aspects of the place as a whole. Not just the creative district, but all of those people who are in the place and who also pass through and relate to the place, because very often there is a shortage of resources. So you need to link to the outside world in order to ensure that there is a flow of resources and attention into and around your creative district. So I think that becomes extremely important. And what we've also found to be crucial in the development of not just creative districts, but also creative programs in general, is the need to take risks. Because if you're doing exactly the same as a creative district down the road or in the next city, then it's unlikely that people will sit up and take notice of you. Surprise is one of the most valuable weapons in the development arsenal of a creative district. So you need to really get out of your comfort zone, take risks, and to think about what you can do, which is innovative, which will provide new creative potential for the people that are living in or using or working in your district, and how that will help to stimulate innovation and innovative experiences for everybody.
Greg, many, many thanks. It was fantastic.
Thank you. Many thanks
Thanks
for
a
inviting me.
lot, and see you soon, okay?
Yes, hopefully next time in Brazil.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thanks a lot, George.
Okay. Bye, 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 bye.
Bye.